On a warm June night in 1994, Los Angeles was doing what it always did, humming with traffic, ambition, and the quiet assumption that celebrity lived just down the street. Then, abruptly, it wasn't quiet anymore. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were found murdered outside a condominium in Brentwood, and the ripple that followed moved faster and louder than anyone could have imagined. Within days, the case ceased to be merely a criminal investigation and became something distinctly West Coast in scale and style. A collision of fame, race, media, law, and spectacle that would dominate the region's attention for years and leave the rest of the country squinting westward, trying to keep up. I don't like to go to dark places on this channel, but if you didn't live through this episode of the West Coast's history, then you can't really understand how big this thing was. You couldn't go anywhere without encountering someone talking about it. It was a sensation that condensed the region's contradictions into a single daily broadcast. Hollywood gloss and domestic violence horror, high-tech forensic science and human error, racial history and courtroom theater, civic trauma, and pop culture comedy. This video is less about the trial itself and more about what it was like as an average Californian teenager to go through one of the biggest, most all-consuming media circuses in U.S. history. Was he really innocent or guilty? Who knows? I'm not here to give my personal opinions. I'm just here to give you my own view on this strange and tragic moment in history. So let's start with the man at the center of it all, Orenthal James Simpson, or O.J. Simpson, also known as the Juice. This former NFL star had electrified football fields in the 1970s. After that, he became an actor, appearing in such classics as The Towering Inferno and the Naked Gun series, demonstrating a range that encompassed both serious drama and hilarious slapstick comedy. He was also a pitchman, a fixture at charity events and upscale gatherings, a recognizable presence whose smile had been polished by decades of public approval. He moved easily through Brentwood dinner parties and television studios, the kind of famous person who felt familiar enough that strangers spoke about him as if he were a neighbor. His was the relaxed, sunlit version of California fame, the kind that seemed friendly and omnipresent, as if it might wave back at you from a convertible idling at a red light on Sunset Boulevard. That deep familiarity was part of why the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman on June 12, 1994, landed with such overwhelming force. The crime itself was savage and horrifying, but the setting made it even more jarring. This was Brentwood, a quiet, affluent enclave where hedges were neatly trimmed and the nights were usually uneventful. Palm trees and stucco walls stood as silent witnesses to violence that felt fundamentally out of place, shattering the postcard image of Los Angeles as a city of sunshine and ease. Nicole Brown Simpson had met O.J. Simpson years earlier when she was still a teenager working as a waitress, and their relationship had unfolded under a shadow that many people in retrospect realized they had not wanted to see clearly. Their marriage had been turbulent and painful, marked by repeated incidents of domestic violence that were documented, reported, and discussed long before the night she was killed. Friends, family members, and police officers all knew pieces of that history. Ron Goldman, a young waiter with plans and a social life of his own, was simply returning a pair of glasses as a favor. He stepped into a scene of sudden brutality and became, in the cruelest possible way, part of a story that would eclipse nearly everything else in American culture for years. From the beginning, the case felt cinematic, but not in the controlled, satisfying way of a movie. It felt chaotic and invasive, like a film crew had arrived without permission and refused to leave. The police investigation moved quickly, and suspicion focused almost immediately on Simpson, in part because of his history with Nicole, and in part because of the physical evidence that began to accumulate. 5 days after the murders, when Simpson failed to turn himself in at the agreed time, the story veered sharply from tragedy into something stranger and more surreal. The low-speed chase down Los Angeles freeways in a white Ford Bronco became an unplanned broadcast event that no one on the West Coast could escape. Watched by an estimated 95 million people, it froze the region in place. Bars fell silent, living rooms filled, offices abandoned productivity. Game 5 of the NBA Finals disappeared from television's mid-play. The pursuit transformed Southern California's freeways into a stage. Traffic helicopters hovering overhead as if drawn by instinct. concrete overpasses filled with onlookers holding signs and waving. It was difficult to explain to anyone who did not live through it just how surreal it felt to watch routine traffic updates dissolve into a live criminal drama. The familiar infrastructure of daily commuting suddenly recast as the backdrop for history. When Simpson was arrested and formally charged, the case moved into the Los Angeles County Superior Court and settled in for a long, exhausting stay. The trial that began in January 1995 and ended in October of that year carried the formal title, The People of the State of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, but almost no one used it. It was simply called The Trial, or, as the media quickly decided, the Trial of the Century. Cameras were allowed inside the courtroom, a decision that would later be debated endlessly. And on the West Coast in particular, the proceedings became part of daily routine. Lunch breaks were planned around testimony. Employers quietly accepted that productivity would dip whenever something dramatic happened in court. Office televisions were tuned to court TV, sometimes muted, sometimes not. Even people who insisted they were not following the case could, by the end of the day, summarize the arguments, identify the lawyers, and repeat the latest soundbite. The cast of characters unfolding before the cameras was unusually vivid, even by California standards. Simpson's defense team, quickly labeled the Dream Team, included Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, F. Lee Bailey, Alan Dershowitz, and Robert Kardashian, among others. They were articulate, theatrical, and acutely aware of the audience beyond the jury box. They understood not only the law, but the cultural moment they were operating in, and they tailored their approach accordingly. Across the aisle sat prosecutors Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, who believed they had assembled a compelling case built on forensic evidence, motive, and opportunity. Clark, in particular, became a familiar figure to viewers, her daily wardrobe and courtroom demeanor dissected with a level of attention usually reserved for movie stars. Presiding over it all was Judge Lance Ito, whose measured tone, patience, and willingness to allow live coverage contributed to the sense that this was not merely a legal proceeding, but a kind of civic theater playing out in real time for millions. Much of the trial revolved around DNA evidence, which at the time was still new enough to feel both impressive and confusing to the general public. The prosecution presented what it described as a mountain of forensic material: blood drops at the crime scene, blood in Simpson's Bronco, fibers, hairs, gloves, shoe prints, and what appeared to be a physical trail connecting the murders to Simpson's home. To the prosecution, this evidence formed a coherent narrative. To the defense, it was an opportunity. They countered with a story of contamination, mishandling, incompetence, and outright police misconduct, arguing that the evidence could not be trusted and that reasonable doubt saturated the entire case. This argument found fertile ground in Los Angeles, where anger toward the Los Angeles Police Department remained raw after the beating of Rodney King and the riots that followed. On the West Coast, particularly within African American communities, skepticism toward law enforcement was not theoretical. It was rooted in lived experience, passed down stories, and recent history that was impossible to ignore. Certain moments from the trial escaped the courtroom entirely and entered the broader culture. When Simpson tried on the leather gloves found at the crime scene and at his home and appeared to struggle with them, the image alone seemed to freeze time. The phrase that followed, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," became a slogan that transcended the case itself, quoted by people who barely understood the evidence but understood the power of a rhyme. When audio tapes surfaced revealing that Detective Mark Furman had used racist language in the past, they detonated like a delayed charge, severely damaging the prosecution's credibility in the eyes of many jurors and viewers. These moments were replayed endlessly on local news, analyzed on talk shows, and recycled into jokes by late-night hosts. In Los Angeles especially, where entertainment and news have always shared a porous boundary, the trial became a kind of ongoing series, complete with recurring characters and cliffhangers. What made the trial uniquely West Coast was not only its location, but the way it was absorbed into everyday life. The Los Angeles Times ran front-page stories for more than 300 days, treating the case as a central narrative of the city itself. Radio hosts debated jury selection and testimony during morning and evening commutes, their voices filling cars stuck on the same freeways where the Bronco chase had unfolded. Soap operas were interrupted by breaking news, and then their audiences became some of the trial's most most dedicated followers, complaining when coverage ended. The case blurred professional boundaries in strange ways. Limo drivers, house guests, forensic technicians, and minor witnesses found themselves briefly famous, recognized in grocery stores and quoted in tabloids. Even fashion became part of the conversation, with courtroom hairstyles, suits, and body language scrutinized and discussed as if they were part of a red carpet event. When the jury returned a not guilty verdict on October 3, 1995, the reaction exposed divisions that ran far deeper than the case itself. In Los Angeles and across the country, responses split largely along racial lines. Many African Americans viewed the acquittal as a justified rebuke to a justice system they believed had long failed them, while many white Americans saw it as a baffling rejection of what they perceived as overwhelming evidence. On the West Coast, memories of the unrest of 1992 shaped every reaction. Law enforcement prepared for riots that never quite arrived. Offices once again paused work to watch the verdict read live. Water usage dropped as people avoided leaving their televisions. Stock trading slowed. For a brief moment, it felt as if the entire region was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The legal story did not end with the verdict. In 1997, a civil jury found Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of Brown and Goldman, awarding damages that decades later remain largely unpaid. Beyond the courtroom, the case continued to ripple outward. It influenced legislation related to domestic violence, reshaped conversations about race, celebrity, and policing, and became a standard reference point in law schools for discussions about evidence, narrative framing, and reasonable doubt. It embedded itself permanently in popular culture, resurfacing again and again in films, television shows, music, and comedy, often with a tone that mixed discomfort, satire, and unresolved anger. But the real question is, why was the O.J. Simpson trial such a media sensation? There had been celebrity trials before. In 1990, there had been Christian Brando, who had murdered his sister's boyfriend. How about John DeLorean, the man who tried to sell you good-looking but bad-running cars, paid for by brokering cocaine deals? And even in the 1990s, the murder of Sharon Tate and the Manson family's reign of terror was still fresh in the minds of many. So why was this seen as the trial of the century for the average West Coaster? I was a senior in high school when the trial started in January 1995, and I swear the O.J. Simpson trial was like a new elective nobody signed up for, but everyone got enrolled in anyway. It didn't matter if you were the kind of person who watched the news or the kind of person who only watched MTV and whatever came on after The Simpsons. The trial found you. It seeped into the day the way fog seeps into the sunset. Quietly at first, then suddenly it's everywhere and you can't see around it. And you're arguing about it while waiting for the muni, like this is normal behavior for teenagers. At home, the trial lived on the TV the way a soap opera lives on the TV, except it was real and it was happening in Los Angeles and the stakes were horrifying. It was on in the background while my mom cooked, while my dad pretended not to pay attention, while I did homework that kept getting interrupted by somebody saying, "Wait, listen, this part matters." In class, teachers acted like we were above it, like we were serious students studying serious things. But then somebody would roll in a little TV on a cart, or a teacher would bring in a radio like it was an emergency weather update. It felt like living through the last giant national story before the internet fully took over, when everyone was still getting their information from the same handful of channels and the same newspapers, and the whole country could be pulled into the same room at the same time. As for O.J. Simpson, I knew very well who he was. While I'm not a major football fan, and his NFL career ended when I was 2 years old, I'd seen him in the towering inferno. Mostly, I knew him as Nordberg from the Naked Gun movies, the affable doofus who seemed to take a majority of the physical abuse. I always thought he was really funny, and honestly, I couldn't believe the same guy who was being dragged under the front of Frank Drebin's car while taking traffic cones to the groin had played such a serious, straight-faced security guard less than 20 years earlier. To my mind, and to the minds of many in my class, he was this famous, friendly-seeming presence from sports and commercials and movies. Like a celebrity your parents didn't have to explain. The shock wasn't just that Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were murdered in this brutal, terrifying way. It was that the person tied to it wasn't some stranger with a mugshot, but a public figure who belonged to the safe, category in people's minds. Adults kept repeating how beloved he'd been. They said it like it was evidence in itself, like being charming on television was a kind of alibi. Then the story got darker and darker as people talked more openly about the domestic violence, about the 911 call, about how the police had been to their house before. I remember feeling angry in this particular teenage way. Like, how did everyone know and still act surprised? How did it take a murder for people to say the words out loud? I think a lot of what affected our interest in the trial was the fact that Los Angeles really does dominate everything in this state. San Francisco is a big city, and we're 400 miles away from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. But what happens in LA always, without exception, captures the attention of people living in the Bay Area. We're two cities in the same cultural orbit, like the Earth and the Moon, but compared to LA and its influence on culture, the fundamentals that hold the fabric of American society and entertainment together, San Francisco is very much the subordinate. When Los Angeles sneezes, we take notice. If San Francisco sneezed, I don't think Los Angeles would notice for a week at best. Anyway, it's this context that shaped why we took so much of an interest, and it played out so perfectly, like a murder mystery series, a multi-part episode of Kojak for the 1990s. You could come home from school, and there it was, like, welcome back, previously on the trial. And for tonight's episode, it had characters you could love or hate, personalities you could root for or despise, hoping they'd come undone in the third act right before the credits rolled. And you could sit there on the sofa with your family, gloating about how they got theirs. I remember thinking it was insane that some random guy like Kato Kalin could become famous just for being adjacent to the story. It was insane that people had strong opinions about Judge Ito's vibe, but they did. People called him calm. People called him starstruck. People said he lost control. People said the cameras made everyone perform. I didn't have the vocabulary then to talk about reality television, but it felt like the first big national example of it. Real people, real consequences, and everyone acting slightly different because they knew they were being watched. Even I could tell that the decision to televise the trial changed everything. It made the trial not just a trial, but a daily show with ratings. It's kind of like in the classic movie Network, where Faye Dunaway's character wants to televise footage of actual bank robberies, piping into the living rooms of regular people a harsh reality not curated for mainstream audiences, not dictated by demographics or test viewings. By the way, watch Network if you haven't already. It's one of the best satirical films ever made. Anyway, people joked that it was positively addictive, and it was. It didn't matter that it was gruesome and sad. It had cliffhangers, personalities, rivalries, catchphrases. It had the feeling of history happening in real time, and the trick was you didn't know the ending, which is what made it different from everything else we watched. When people ask me these days what it was like, I always think first of the sheer amount of coverage. People complained, then kept watching. People said they didn't care, then could name every lawyer and half the witnesses anyway. My aunt and my grandma would call and give a nightly recap like she was reporting from the front lines. Teachers would sigh and say, "All right, 5 minutes, then we get back to calculus." And we all knew that was a lie. There was something also very scary about it in an existential way, because from it you could gauge the opinions of those around you, as well as the system that was meant to uphold the basic law and justice of this country. San Francisco is a naturally progressive and left-leaning place, for good or for ill, and we've often prided ourselves as the gay capital of the world. But the O.J. Simpson trial revealed a lot of very visceral opinions that came straight down racial lines, even from people who were regular Democrat voters and liberal to the core, or at least you thought they were. Some people treated the trial like proof that the whole system was broken. Some people treated it like proof that the system was working, because reasonable doubt is the rule, not a vibe. Some people couldn't talk about it without talking about race. Some people couldn't stand that race was being talked about at all. And because I was 18 and my brain was basically a sponge with opinions, I noticed the way conversations changed depending on who was in the room. At school, you'd hear one thing in a group of mostly white kids, another thing when the group got more mixed, another thing again when you were talking to adults who had lived through more history than we had. The 1992 LA riots and Rodney King were constantly brought up. While San Francisco had not been the heart of the confrontation, we did have our own set of riots during that period, and so when the defense started leaning into the idea that the LAPD couldn't be trusted, that evidence could be mishandled or worse, a lot of people didn't hear it as an outrageous conspiracy. They heard it as an extension of something they already believed, that the police could be brutal, racist, sloppy and protected anyway. In our city, people made comparisons to issues with the SFPD, but LA had the big, televised, undeniable symbol. It made the whole trial feel like it was about more than 2 murders, which is part of what made it so consuming and also part of what made it feel so wrong. 2 people were dead, and sometimes it felt like the country was using their deaths as a screen to project every argument it had been storing up. And then there was the prosecution itself. Even as a teenager, even without understanding every legal detail, I could feel the frustration in the air. People would say things like, "How are they messing this up?" Like the prosecution had been handed what looked like a slam dunk and kept stepping on the ball. It wasn't just that the defense team was flashy and expensive and obviously better at stagecraft. It was that the police investigation seemed full of mistakes that the defense could pick apart forever. Chain of custody, gloves, blood, lab procedures. The defense didn't have to prove a different story. They just had to make the official story feel contaminated, compromised, and ultimately corrupted. And the prosecution, whether they deserved it or not, started to feel like the stiff, outmatched side of a drama that was being directed by the defense. The glove moment is burned into my memory, even though I wasn't sitting there in the courtroom. I caught it after school during replays on that hot June Thursday, and seeing O.J. struggle with the glove, watching the lawyers' faces, it felt like one of those moments you could sense becoming a slogan in real time. I knew right there that this was going to be parodied for years and years and years, because it was almost cartoonish in its execution. Turns out I was right, because everyone repeated that line. Kids repeated it like it was a joke, like it was a punchline detached from the fact that 2 people had been stabbed to death. Adults repeated it like it was either proof of injustice or proof of manipulation, depending on what they already believed. And the Furman tapes, when they came out, didn't just hurt the prosecution. They blew a hole through the idea that the trial was only about evidence. A police detective caught in a lie about racist language in a city already inflamed by police racism. That was gasoline on a fire that was already burning. What was the public perception of Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden where I was? Complicated, but also kind of brutally simple. People seemed to feel sorry for them and judge them at the same time. They were seen as hardworking but outgunned, sincere but not in control of the story. And sometimes, yes, incompetent or at least strategically clumsy. Teenagers are not merciful critics. We call them out of their league, the way we talk about a team getting demolished. It sounds awful now, because they were dealing with real deaths and real grieving families, but the trial had trained everyone to talk like sports commentators. That's what living through it did. It turned civic tragedy into a spectator event, and then it made us all feel weird and gross for being spectators. The question everyone asked each other all year was basically, did you think he did it? And what's wild is how many people had 2 answers. There was the answer about guilt and the answer about the verdict. I heard people say, he did it, but they had to acquit. Like, those were separate ideas that could coexist. I heard people say, especially when they were trying to be careful, that the black community wasn't necessarily saying innocent so much as not guilty. And that the celebration, some people did, was less about O.J. and more about sticking a thumb in the eye of a system that had never handed out fairness evenly. Could you tell what type of person someone was based on how they felt? Sometimes. There were people who treated the trial like proof that money makes reality. There were people who treated it like proof that cops lie and get away with it unless you have the cash to fight back. There were people who treated it like proof that the country was sick with celebrity worship. There were people who treated it like proof that media could hypnotize an entire nation. And there were people who just wanted it to stop, who were exhausted by the wall-to-wall coverage, who felt like we were all being forced to watch something grim and personal until it turned into noise. By the time the verdict came, I think a lot of people could sense the tide shifting, even if they didn't want to admit it. The defense had been hammering reasonable doubt into the public brain for months. The prosecution felt like it was always responding instead of leading. Judge Ito felt, to a lot of observers, like he was managing a circus instead of a courtroom, even if that wasn't fair. And there was this constant background talk about riots, about what would happen if O.J. was convicted, about Los Angeles as a city still carrying trauma from 1992. Even up in San Francisco, we heard that tension, like weather reports from a different climate zone that could still reach us. The day of the verdict, I remember the energy. I wasn't in school anymore by October 1995, but the feeling in the city was the same as any big event day, like a championship game, except this wasn't supposed to be entertainment. I was out walking my dog in the city just after 10 a.m. when I heard voices talk frantically about the verdict. From open doors to bars, to grocery stores playing the news on the radio, to passing cars with their windows down, there was both applause and silence. But I was amazed at how subdued it was. I was expecting Super Bowl levels of partying from the acquittal side and rancorous outrage from the guilty side. But no, there was just discussion. Civil, intelligent, sometimes heated, but mostly just talk. I don't remember seeing anyone beating each other bloody in the street over differing opinions, just agreeing to disagree. Was it a shock? For me, yes and no. I wasn't shocked that the defense had created doubt. I was shocked that it was enough to produce a not guilty verdict when, from the way it was talked about, the evidence seemed overwhelming. I also remember the feeling that what I just watched wasn't only a legal decision. It was a cultural explosion. The verdict didn't land like case closed, it landed like argument begins. Afterward, the trial didn't disappear. It just changed forms. It became jokes on late-night shows and SNL. It became that story people would reference as shorthand for celebrity getting away with things. It became this dark cultural landmark, like remember where you were when, and because I was young and paying attention in my clumsy teenage way, it also became the moment I realized that the justice system isn't a neat machine that produces clean truth. It's a human system. It's storytelling, it's procedure, it's persuasion, it's what a jury believes is reasonable, shaped by the world they live in and the history they carry. Watching it every day made that impossible to unsee. So, looking back, the O.J. Simpson trial reads less like a discrete historical event and more like a mirror held up to the West Coast in the 1990s. It reflected celebrity culture at its most powerful, media saturation at its most relentless, racial tension at its most exposed, and a justice system struggling to function under the weight of constant observation. The story was tragic at its core, rooted in real loss and violence, yet it unfolded with a distinctly California excess, sprawling, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. For better or worse, it became a shared experience, one that turned courtrooms into living rooms and freeways into history, leaving behind a chapter of American life that still resists being neatly closed.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199 on X, we're here just for you.